Welcome to Anchoring the Consciousness of Oneness World Summit. Our guest for this segment is Joe Weston. And we will be talking about developing resilient power and fierce compassion in times of challenge and change. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. It's good to be discussing this. I get to talk about things that I love and talk to people that I love.
Yes, looking forward to it. So the first question that comes up is this phrase, resilient power. There's a lot of demonstrations of power in the world right now and discussions of what power is. What would you say resilient power is?
That's a big question, as you can imagine. When you start playing with the word power, it's almost, you're going back thousands of years of trying to unravel what it is and how it's been used. It comes into as an important theme, an important central component of the work that I've developed called respectful confrontation, which is, I say, a practice and a method where you can train yourself to have the courage and the skills to stand in your power, speak your truth, get your needs met in a way where you don't get harmed and other people don't get harmed. And that's an important point, I think, in what is unfolding on the planet at this moment, is this idea, what does it mean to stand in your power? What does it mean to speak your truth? And of course, what does it mean to get your needs met? But more importantly, how can you do that without harming yourself or getting harmed or harming others? So in this work, I've done a lot of investigation of really understanding what's keeping us from all, which is our natural state. You could say, I go with a belief, if you're talking about power, that if you're tapping into this idea of a larger sense of power, prana, chi, or the power between us or internal power, it's unlimited. And we have access to it at all times. And if it's unlimited and we have access to it at all times, what's keeping us from accessing that? And it's always there. We don't have to work on becoming more powerful. We're powerful enough. The work is, and that's the hard work, is working through all the viewpoints and trauma and enculturation and conditioning, which have set up barriers for us to access it at any moment that we choose to. So the respectful confrontation work is unraveling all of that and confronting, coming face to face with a lot of the stories and the viewpoints and the habits and the patterns that we're getting stuck in, particularly around power and how it's played out in the world, where you could say the world really resonates from a place of power over. So the question is, how do we tap into that? And actually, in my research and study of all of this, I came up with 3 themes that I realized that because of these themes, and I call them unexamined assumptions, because we've made these unexamined assumptions around certain themes, what we've done is we've limited ourselves and our capacity to expand into our full oneness with ourselves and our oneness and our connection with others and our oneness to all. If you're interested, I can tell you what those 3 themes are.
Please.
The first one is the question of how is true power different from brute force? And in a sense, the whole training is a journey of really feeling, not only intellectually coming up with an idea, not just contemplating it, but actually through somatic exercises, through practice, experiencing it within yourself and how it plays out with others. So, what I was noticing is that for many of us, because we didn't examine it, we think that true power is the same thing as brute force, or you can use the word resilient power. If we think it's the same, and we tend to be people that are more heart-centered, peace-centered, and we think that being in our power means brute force, unfortunately, we don't step into our power. This is all unconscious. And that's the first theme. The second theme is if we don't examine it, we tend to believe that confrontation is the same thing as conflict. And you see that in the news. You'll see there was a confrontation on the corner of, and all of that. And so, and what we examine in respectful confrontation, that confrontation is simply an expression of coming face to face with an open heart that actually leads to deepening of a relationship. But if we think that confrontation is the same thing as conflict, then unfortunately we don't deepen relationship. We don't go through that process. We don't stand in our power. And the last one is, without examining it, we think that assertiveness is the same thing as aggression. And we see that play out a lot. And again, if we don't see that they're different because we haven't examined it, then we don't assert ourselves. So we're living in a culture of many people who aren't standing in their power, who aren't having those important conversations that lead to deepening of relationship, and aren't asserting their truth and expressing their needs. So in the respectful confrontation model, we break them down and show how resilient power, true power, is different from brute force, how confrontation is different from conflict, and how assertiveness is different from aggression, so that you can feel more confident to stand in your power, speak your truth, get your needs met, without it leading to aggression. Now, the first part of that resilient power, how it's different from brute force, there's many aspects that I can bring in around that. It's what is our antidote to power over? And so, and I do this now with one of the projects I've been working on is working with women's rights organizations in the Middle East. And I'm particularly working at this moment, working with a women's rights organization in Gaza, where they had a brilliant strategy that they decided to train men to become ambassadors, to go back into their communities, to train other men how to stop beating their wives, and how and to talk to them about reframing their viewpoints on patriarchy, on aggression, on masculinity, and on power. And the model, one of the models, so as you can tell, I'm very much involved with how do we shift our viewpoints, our patterns and habits around power. And one thing I offer in terms of what's the antidote to power over, it starts with power within. How do we cultivate power within? And that's a real, again, it's a real somatic thing. It's not just an idea. And power within, yes, you may experience a sense of power, a sense of oneness when you're sitting on your meditation cushion or when you're hanging out with a tree. But can you also cultivate that same level of resilience when you're in a business meeting, or when someone on the street pushes you, or when someone cuts you off in their car? Can you cultivate that sense of power within, from a place of resilience? When you have cultivated more sense of power within, then you instantly spontaneously want to reach out to the next phase, power with. You want to connect and ally with others, create more oneness, create more solidarity with those that are aligned with your values. You've suddenly strengthened that inner sense of power within, coming from a place of hopefully love and fierce compassion and resilience. When you have activated a certain level of power within, power with, and you're now a stronger unit, you just naturally, spontaneously want to move to the next phase, which is power to. How can we, as empowered beings, continue to mutually empower one another to then, as a unit, go with our unified strength, go out and support those in need? And so that's a way of, and as those who feel disempowered begin to feel stronger and powerful, then that just naturally, without even having to confront power over, it just naturally weakens power over. How's that for a start?
I love it. It seems like a wise way to take on the forces that are shaping our world right now, to say that we can act from that power within, and that is a power with and a power to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struck by the tension of the words respectful and confrontation next to each other. It causes one to raise an eyebrow. That you're right. I think most of us associate confrontation with conflict. And it sounds great to want to make it respectful, but we don't like, most of us don't like conflict. Some people seek it. Is that intentional that you would couple those words?
Funny you should ask. The answer is yes. Yeah. For me, it actually, the words itself create the actual experience of what the beauty is of respectful confrontation. It creates a tension, and not a tension from grasping or a tension from shut off or contraction, but the necessary tension that what I would say is alchemical, a friction. Creativity, all things grow and develop. There's some level of if you look at alchemy, if you look at creativity, if you look at birth, there's some level of a friction or an uncomfortableness that takes people out of their corners. If you look using the metaphor of boxers, you could say that takes them out of their stances of I'm going to win, and gets them in that what I would call the empowered vulnerability, where we don't know what the next moment is going to be. It brings us into the full moment. It brings us into union. It brings us into a certain level of oneness. And it's in that, and it's a messy place. And we don't have control over it. It simply is. And we are not trained to be in that place. I mean, many of us are meditators. We which is great. And we're training in that, in mindfulness and martial arts, Tai Chi, and all the different practices we're doing is training us for that. To be more present and to understand the power of union. What respectful confrontation does, it takes it into your everyday life of how can you be with that with the cashier? How can you be with that with your boss? And it's not that you're going to stare gazingly into your boss's eyes for 20 minutes before you have a difficult conversation, but that you do learn the resilience of having to stay regulated with your nervous system. Stay in your core, where I would say your personal power resides. Mostly stay in your heart, where understanding resides, where wisdom resides, where respect and dignity for others resides, where love resides, where fierce compassion resides, where your humanity resides. And guess what? That person who's sitting across from you, even if they're an opponent, that's where their humanity resides as well. And do we have the courage and skills to actually go through that process and journey of connecting from that place? So respectful confrontation, in a sense, there is an alchemy in that. Because and if you notice with the three themes I gave you, what I was doing was I was cracking through polarities. I believe it's the polarities that keep us limited, imprisoned, keep us in separation, this or that. So the three themes in the full exploration of the training we do is cracking that open and see that you don't have two choices. You have a myriad of choices. Choices is freedom, which is power. So in respectful confrontation, many of us, because we haven't taken the time to really examine it, we're wired in a certain way. And some of us are wired to where confrontation is easy. Whatever we think confrontation is, it's easy for us. Yeah, I can say whatever I want. I can get my needs met. I speak my truth. I'm always the one that people hear, and I'm the one who takes charge. And that's a great quality. And to all of you listening, you know who you are. And let's honor that. The question, though, is it at the expense of the deepening of the relationship? Or is it at the expense of the collaboration? Or is it at the expense of just simply listening? Because the person that you're engaging with may not be wired that way and may not feel safe enough to share what they want to share, which means you may be missing valuable information. So that's the one polarity. The other polarity is the respectful part. You can say, I'm the peacemaker. I'm the one who makes sure everyone's doing okay. I'm the one that people rely on, and you know who you are, if that's who you are. And there are some wonderful qualities in that. The question, though, it might be at the expense of you getting your needs met and having the impact in the world that you would like to have. And that was fundamentally the reason why developed the respectful confrontation training was noticing with myself and others in Dharma centers, in spiritual communities, in self-help communities, in corporate and also in nonprofits, people who had really something to offer, their wisdom, their talents, their gifts, their time, but didn't feel empowered enough to figure out how they can actually have the impact they wanted to have. And that is the core essence of this work, and that is this idea of fierce compassion, which I can get to. But going back to respectful confrontation, so we get stuck in this, I'm either the confronter, the loud one, or I'm the quiet one, or whatever. What this does is it helps all of us to develop the skills of both sides, so that the respectful one feels more confident to speak their truth. The confronter one feels more confident to listen. And it's about coming to the middle. And when I say middle, please, I don't mean politically. I mean coming to more union and resonance, which is a scary place to move into if you feel safe where you are. And it's in that place, it's messy, it's uncomfortable. And that's where I've seen in all the work I've done, whether it's with NASA or whether it's with combat veterans or with incarcerated men or with women or with anyone I've worked with, that what they have said was, when I've dared to actually apply this, where there were no solutions, suddenly new solutions emerge. And where we're usually in this place of win-lose, we find that we can get to more of a sense of win-win. We're more resilient in how we can listen to each other and speak and negotiate needs and be in that messy until we get to the other side and find deepening of relationship and creative new solutions.
It seems like you're implying that oneness is messy and uncomfortable too.
I guess that's what I'm implying, yeah. Or it may be, and how wonderful, and it may not be, how wonderful. It is what it is. That's the thing. You can't quantify it. You can't put a quality on it. It just is. At least that's how I see it. The journey to get there is messy if we're not already realized beings, if we're not already awake. Then it can't be anything else but messy, you could say. And that's why many of us are not finding the ways to actually get to the other side of that journey. There's so many ways we get distracted or frightened, or we act out. And on some level, that is really, again, what the respectful confrontation work offers, is because you could say, by tapping into your own sense of internal power, you're tapping into the part of you that may have easy access to oneness. I don't know. I'm speculating. And the human species has come up with some very clever ways to avoid that. So what I like to offer, particularly when I'm working with more advanced students, is to learn the terrain and have the necessary skills to be resilient enough, courageous enough, empowered enough to move through it. Yeah.
I'd love to go back to that theme of assertiveness. This is mostly a spiritual community that is watching these videos, and we've had experience of power within. I would say many of us, we've had experience of power over towards us. And I think the spiritual norm is that assertiveness is dangerous. Assertiveness is very close to aggression. And what is the need in today's world for assertiveness, and what does that look like?
Well, I'll probably give another roller coaster kind of answer to answer your question. So bear with me, buckle up. Um, I think if the way I'm feeling like I want to answer that, it has to do again with a sense of polarity, particularly speaking to meditators or people who are used to spiritual retreats and practices, is when do we feel safe? And I think it's very easy to open to that surrender to oneness, that surrender to union, that surrender to our deepest selves, our wisdom, and our higher selves, for instance, you could even say, when we know we're in a safe environment. So spiritual centers, Dharma centers, the retreat centers, that's a safe place to do it. But that doesn't mean that we're not still being aggressive to each other and passively aggressive, or what we now call microaggressions, that we're not even aware of how we're harming each other. And particularly, that's where some of the impetus for this work was to be in Dharma centers and to see, when we're in the Gompa, when we're in the meditation hall, our hearts are open, we're resonating from the highest values. But then it comes to, whoever works there, it's like, who's going to clean the toilets? Who's going to, and suddenly we're back to, or we spend a beautiful weekend with our hearts open and we understand oneness with all. And we get into our cars, and with 20 minutes of the retreat being over, we're screaming at the driver who just cut us off. And I'm speaking for myself, so I'm not speaking, so just so, we all do this, we're human. And what is that? To me, I would say that you could say it's kind of a disconnect. And so I think the question of what is assertiveness is, how do we take, because what do we want to assert, right? We want to assert the very things that we're developing in these retreats, which is understanding what wisdom is, and embodied wisdom, and living that, and studying the teachings of the great teachers, and wanting to, I would think, at least I'll speak for myself, it's one thing for personal attainment, which I think we need to do. I personally think at this time on this planet, 2018, we need, and I don't like to talk in this way often, but I'm feeling compelled based on what's happening on the planet at the moment. The planet needs us. The literal planet needs us. Human beings need us. Creatures that are going extinct need us. What are we doing at every moment of our lives to be of service to this planet and to these beings that need us? This is my truth. I'm not saying anyone else has to, I'm not saying if anyone's doing this or not, whether they're good or bad or whatever. So to me, that is where assertiveness comes in. Assertiveness in this context is not about confronting bullies. That's something different. Assertiveness is resonating from your highest self. How are you asserting that in the world? In a way that's not proselytizing, that's not being a missionary, that's not being self-righteous, that's not judging others and forcing others into a viewpoint that they may not want to have. It's resonating from your embodied wisdom, from your energetic wisdom, from your heart, and from your core, to be of service. And so I think what plays into this, and it comes into this question of oneness. So what is the polarity of oneness? Separation. So what is the disconnect between our capacity to be in these higher states in retreat centers, and what can we cultivate to feel safe to take that, our whole system feels safe to take that into the world? And from one of my traditions, from Tibetan Buddhism, if you talk about oneness, in a sense, if you really are going to analyze it and understand the nature of reality, you have to approach it always from 2 points, from the universal and the relative. So, in a sense, you could say we are all one. And, I'm sure that's not the first time you heard that expression. Universally, we are all one. Relatively, not so much. And again, this is my truth. If anyone has a different viewpoint, send me an email, we can discuss. But from my viewpoint, and I think that's also where assertiveness and comes in, and true and resilient power, is to recognize that yes, on one level we are all one, and yet where we are suffering on this planet, we're separate. And to learn how to cultivate within us that constant universal in our hearts and in our core, of the universal oneness, and to, at least I like to think, devote my life to recognizing where there is separation and see what is possible through respectful confrontation, through what I would call respectful assertiveness. That's the alternative, to overcome separation. And in a sense, that again gives another choice, another polarity we have, which is, and I think that's totally playing out in the United States at this moment, and it's being replicated in other countries in the world, is a short-sighted, very short moment in our time, belief again that bullying works. That's really from the last 2,000 years, that's how it was, and it worked. And I believe that we are cultivating something on this planet to see that it's a very old, outdated viewpoint, that bullying works, brute force, that it works. And that's what we're all cultivating, whether we know it or not, I believe. That's the resilient power. So, however, if we're still stuck in the polarity that if someone bullies me, I only have two choices, either be the victim or bully back, then we're just perpetuating the same illusion that bullying works. So again, the respectful confrontation work is cracking that open. What other alternatives do you have to break the illusion that bully victim has to be and that it works? And one phrase in the middle there is respectful assertiveness. How can I assert myself so that I'm still I'm confronting the bully from the perspective of open-hearted face-to-face? I am protecting myself. I don't want to get harmed. And I'm staying resilient and dancing with all the negativity and all the attacks. And this is where, the respectful confrontation is based on martial arts. And particularly the martial arts of Tai Chi and Aikido. And understanding the power of that, the power of softness, the power of flow, the power of balance, and cultivating more strength and power within so that you are more resilient to dance with attacks as they come. And the attacks I'm not talking about are necessarily violent attacks. They could be verbal or just an energetic power over. And how can you still address it, but not come back with, not submit and not come back with it with an attack or run away from it, but learn how to resiliently dance with it to deepen relationship and deepen the level of the subtlety of the conversation where you want to get to some new truths.
That's beautiful. There's another word pairing that you have here. You're not talking about the flow of compassion or soft compassion. You talked about fierce compassion.
Mm-hmm.
What does the fierceness of compassion look like?
It's resilient. It is. It's and I guess you could say you can compare that to, you might compare it to love. It's not a direct this or that, but you can, someone might say that they're a loving being. Some might say that they're a compassionate being, and there are different flavors of activation of heart energy or wisdom. In Tibetan Buddhism, the definitions, and I would imagine, I think all Buddhism, that the definition of love is the desire to make someone happy and acting on that desire. That's all it is. It's a verb. So if you want to go love someone, just consider, activate your own desire to make someone else happy and act on it. You've just shifted the planet, period. Again, that's my belief, but that's, let's just say, period. The definition of compassion is the desire to alleviate the suffering of others and acting on that desire. I tend to be more wired towards compassion than love. I love hanging out with people who are more into love because they're loving beings. For me, it's more about what can I do to alleviate the suffering, which means alleviate separation, which means the aspects of us that are not connecting to oneness. And sometimes being nice is a great way to express compassion and alleviate people's suffering. Sometimes being nurturing is a great way to do that. Sometimes being protective is a great way to do that. Sometimes you have to be fierce and, in a sense, have the courage and the skills to have the difficult conversations that most people won't. And this is cracking through what I would say many of us suffer from, is what I call chronic niceness. Is our strategy of survival has been around, or our belief system has convinced us that being nice is the way to go, but not seeing that that works sometimes. Better nice than harmful. But sometimes we get stuck in our niceness and don't feel empowered, for instance, when we should say yes, when we should say no. We say yes when we should say no, or we say no when we should say yes. Or when we sit back and watch an injustice happening and not addressing it. And so I can give a quick example of what for me fierce compassion is. I tell the story often in my trainings, is, years ago, I was hanging out with a group of friends, and one of them started asking us, the rest of us, for money. And we would give it because we were chronically nice. It's what we do. And we also noticed that he was doing more drugs and that the money was going towards the drugs. And we allowed this to happen. We were enabling him because of our chronic niceness. And at a certain point, I really wrestled with that. Do I continue to do this? Because on some level, it's breaking down the relationship. We're disempowering him. We're feeling resentful and disempowered. And I thought, I need to say something from a place of compassion. It required fierceness, because I knew he wasn't going to take the story well, or what I had to say well. And he didn't. I confronted him in a respectful way from my heart. He acted out, got very angry. He actually turned some of our friends against me. And that hurt deeply for quite a lot, that really hurt. Now, luckily, I was able to run into him at a party like 5 years after that. And he came to me and said, "Joe, I want to thank you. What you said to me made me realize that I do have a problem, and I sought out care and help, and I'm in recovery." So that to me is an example of fierce compassion. You look at the Buddha Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who is the embodiment in Buddhism of all the compassion of all the Buddhas. And, in a sense, you see different images, and I actually refer to them as they. So help me do that, because we're not sure if Avalokiteshvara truly is male or female. So I will use the pronoun they. So as a bodhisattva, they really were dwelling on and feeling the suffering of all beings and was overwhelmed by it. And through many different rounds of really lamenting and despairing with tears flowing for months, and the deepest desire from within their heart to alleviate the suffering of others increased their capacity. They went from being an ordinary human with one head and two arms to a being with 3 heads and 4 arms, eventually to a being with 11 heads and 1,000 arms. And here we talk about the 1,000-arm Avalokiteshvara. Those are symbols of increased capacity. Think about first of all, think about the great massages you can give with 1,000 hands, or all the different things that you can do with all of that capacity. Even so, with 11 heads and 1,000 arms, Avalokiteshvara still lamented that that they couldn't alleviate all the suffering. And through another process of deep contemplation, deep meditation, and tears, and a desire to alleviate the suffering of others, manifested as a wrathful deity, which you may have seen on the tankas. And that's not an evil force at all. It's just another aspect of compassion. And it's not that I'm advocating now that people go out and be wrathful with people, because it's not that you're wrathful with them. You're wrathful with the very things that are making these people suffer. And sometimes that fierceness is necessary to help someone cut through their confusion. to gain access to themselves, overcome the separation with themselves and with others and with all.
So I'm curious about the somatic element of this. I know you teach a class at Georgetown University on body-based skill building, and we're talking about a spiritual and a pragmatic topic. But is there's somehow a bodily element to this as well? How does that fit in this work?
Well, I think on some level it has to do with a deeper level of learning. I talk about skills-based learning has three aspects, and I didn't invent this, but I'm just sharing it. So it starts with here in your head with gathering information. Unfortunately, many of us think once we've read a book, we have it, we've learned it, but we haven't integrated it into our lives. And I say one of the unfortunate things about our current situation on this planet is the planet is filled with a myriad of information gatherers who haven't learned very much. So what does it take to actually learn something? Well, the first step is bringing it into your heart to a deeper level of contemplation, personalizing it, understanding the deeper aspects of that information. And the next step is I'm pointing to my core now, which is the dantian below my navel, is bringing it into the body, bringing it into impulse and action. And it's through the action that you really learn. It's trial and error. I don't know many people, at least I can speak for myself. I wasn't an experienced driver in cars the first time I got behind the wheel. I read about it. I thought about it, contemplated it, but it was a long process for me to develop a new habit. So the somatic work takes us into developing new habits. And that is the transformational aspect of this work. Is we know all the theories about nonviolent communication, about how to be more peaceful with each other, about oneness, about and ecology, recycling, all of these things. We know all these things, but did we really change our viewpoints, our patterns, and our habits yet? So the somatic aspects gives us concrete ways to embody this so that we can actually create lasting change.
And I can do this both as an individual and as interacting with others.
Yeah, and that's the more fun part of the training is, you cultivate a sense of more respectful self. You learn how to engage in a more effective way. You learn how to be more assertive. But how do you then deal with the life around you? And that's the resilient part. The name of the course that I do at Georgetown, the full name of the course, which happens to be in the School of Government, Master's Program, School of Government, Department of Conflict Resolution, is Body-Based Skill Building for Navigating Stress and Confrontation. So it's developing skills to learn how to be more resilient in higher stress moments. And on some level, whether that is if you're on the forefront of social change, of ecology change, of economic change, of racial and social justice change, it is always uncomfortable. The level of stress is always high. And imagine if you had skills to be very resilient with your decision-making capacity, where your capacity to keep your heart open and still feel empowered were increased, you would increase your capacity. You'd have 1,000 arms. You get a lot more done. So that's the somatic part of it. It's understanding it from in the body, cultivating that wisdom, and really shifting into changing viewpoints, habits, and patterns.
So I'm imagining that your students are not just sitting in class.
No, we're absorbing information, and the course is really designed to make you uncomfortable. It's a safe laboratory to cultivate more resilience in the uncomfortable. And the basic principle of that is being in a laboratory, understanding the deeper aspects of the power and vulnerability. And that's another rewiring of not seeing vulnerable as weak, and actually seeing and that's one of my fundamental principles that I have through my life. It's in your vulnerability that your true power is revealed. And I can give a story, if I may,
Please.
of how that works and how that instantly, and that is again that fierce compassion. That compassion is also, you're resonating it, bodhicitta. You're resonating heart energy. You're shifting the frequency, the electromagnetic field of yourself and others as you're if you will. For those of you out there who know heart math, you know what I'm talking about. That we can increase and cultivate a higher frequency of our hearts, which has been scientifically proved to influence others and to regulate nervous systems, which calms others down so that you can have more of those stressful conversations. So the story I want to tell is from about the power of vulnerability. So this project that I developed for this group in Gaza, for this women's rights group in Gaza, the idea was to train, it's an 8-module training to train, started with 60 men with groups of about 12, so about 5 groups, who self-selected to come and be trained in this way of working so that they can be ambassadors and share a new way of looking at power and violence and advocate for the rights of women and girls. And I trained women to do this. And these women led these men, and the whole process is a somatic experience of taking them into deeper levels of vulnerability in a safe way. And one man told the story that I heard was one man in module 3, everyone sits in a circle. In module 3, one of the men raised his hand and he says, I have to confess something. And he started telling the story that he comes from a particular district in Gaza where there are 2 families, they're feuding. It's a feuding families. And that it's dangerous, that the men always carry a knife when they leave their home. And that if they're ever seen walking down a street and men from the other family see them, it's going to be a fight. So he told this story, and he said that because of that, since he first received his knife, he's never left the house without his knife. He's always had it on him. So he's sitting in the circle, 3rd module, and he's standing up, and he says, I want to confess and say that for the last 2 modules, I have had my knife in my pocket because I didn't know if I felt safe. And he pulled out his knife and he said, this is the first time in my life that I feel safe somewhere that's not my home. So I'm going to take this knife and I'm going to place it outside of the circle. So that is the transformative power of the work. And that is a way of seeing that gives me good news. Or it lightens my heart to think that in that experience, a deeper level of oneness was created. And it was a risk. There was courage in that.
Yes. So I can see the applicability of the work in a highly stressed conflict zone such as Gaza. But you mentioned that you work with NASA.
Mm-hmm.
Why would a bunch of engineers engage in respectful confrontation?
Well, the fun thing about working with engineers and IT specialists and all this, help them to track what open-heartedness from their minds, from their brilliant, amazing minds. And I love taking that journey. It's so much fun to track that and to find and to help them get to their humanity, which they have, and despite themselves are always shining through in their vulnerability. But I wouldn't tell them that. I mean, on some level, it's a corporate training, so it's to increase productivity at work. So on that level, in terms of communication and deeper levels of collaboration and developing trust and safety. And it addresses the question of basically, how can I increase my impact and my influence and my level of persuasion through these exercises, in whatever way I can to be more effective in what I'm doing. And then they can see that this might work. It's not familiar to them. And, so one of the things that I always say is that one of the fundamental questions of respectful confrontation, since I had as a kid growing up in New York City, which was always volatile, that's where I really started learning the difference between what conflict and confrontation was, and coming from an environment where as a kid I was forced to fight, and my dad coming from that, and a challenging situation. My dad spent some time in jail when I was around 12 years old. So I come from that kind of world. And even there, asking the question, why is it, even though we know better, we're a relatively intelligent species and technologically we're pretty advanced, but why is it, even though we know better, we still have arguments and fights and war and crime and hunger and a sick planet? Now, most people would say that's just the way we are. But I was never satisfied with that answer. So for me, in any situation that arises, if there's tension or conflict, my first instinct is to investigate what could have been the root cause of it. If I can identify the root cause of it, not address what's happening there. That's like putting a Band-Aid on a problem, because the problem will arise again. We know that in our meditation and in our practices. But if we can get to the root cause of it and address that in a respectful way, and in that, we can come up with new solutions. I think that's attractive to engineers and scientists, is that kind of scientific approach. And I get that from the Buddhism. I mean, one of my teachers said that the Buddha was the first psychologist, in a sense, because he understood the nature of mind and human behavior. And this whole work is an examination of human behavior. We want to track our way back to oneness. What is it in our human behavior that's keeping us from that? If on a universal level we already are one, and on a relative level perhaps not, the solution, the causes are in the relative realm. Therefore, the solutions are in the relative realm. That means right there, somewhere around you, is the solution to what you're seeking in terms of overcoming separation and oneness. If you haven't found it yet, it might be that you might be hanging out with the right people, but you need to hang out with other people. Because one thing that came to me, and I thought about it, if only hanging out with people who already agree with you were going to solve our world problems, we would have already solved our world problems. So what is the other alternative? Is connecting with people that don't agree with you and that have different views, and to cultivate the proper amount of fierce compassion, to be able to hear out what people are saying. Again, making sure you're safe and your boundaries are being respected. That to me is the solution. What are we doing to connect to people that are different? And it blows my mind. I'm living in Washington, D.C. It's a funny city, Washington, in many levels. But I find that people don't connect. In my apartment building, I'm in the elevator with someone who lives literally next door to me, and they don't even look at me. Or I walk on the street and there's no connection. In so many ways, we're not connecting. And my question is, if we can't even connect with our neighbors, how do we expect to be able to resolve problems that are happening on the other side of the world? We're so because of the media, because of the internet, we can't, in our hearts, or many of us can't, I can't say all of us, we're too distracted, or on some level not open enough in our capacity for compassion. We can read in a newspaper or on a computer, 10,000 people died in an earthquake somewhere, and it's just information for us. And it's not hitting us in our hearts, and it's certainly not moving us into action. So, in a sense, how do we get to oneness? It starts literally with making eye contact with your neighbor. It's literally, when if you're on a public transportation, don't look at your phone. Look at people, and don't stare, and don't frighten people. And, there's always a way that you can engage with someone. And if you don't feel safe, literally making eye contact or really talking to someone, then when you walk down the street, just instead of thinking about all the stuff that's running through your mind, use that time differently And just as you pass someone, offer them a blessing in your head. These little practices is what is going to be the basis for us to overcome separation so that oneness can naturally arise. It all sounds good, right? It's like, but how do we do it? That's or what cultivates or what compels us to actually take action.
Tell me what a day in the life of Joe Weston looks like. I mean, how do you spend your time? And you live in
That's a good
DC,
question.
you're surrounded by, you live in DC, so you're surrounded by a lot of stress.
Mm-hmm.
How do you navigate that, and what are your practices?
Well, I live in a city like DC. It is energetically, you could say it's challenging. I am blessed and privileged that I have enough money that I can live in a city like this, and I have enough food. And I have the tremendous gratitude that I have the privilege and the capacity to manifest the work that resonates with my heart. So I guess I start with a certain level of knowing that and gratitude as much as I can. And a deep, deep need within myself to impact others so that they too can have that capacity, if they don't, and if they want it. My practices are very important. I've been practicing Tai Chi now for a few decades, and other martial arts, and also Tibetan Buddhism and Taoist alchemy and various different traditions, and continue to study all the traditions and the great teachers. And I particularly needed my daily practice here in DC, just to stay centered and grounded, and shield myself from energies, and not get caught up in the very easy whirlwind roller coaster of what we would call American politics. And my day is really devoted to, again, being as present as I can. And it sounds abstract, but it's true. And my number one priority in my life is my cultivation of relationships. The definition of confrontation for me in the respectful confrontation model is any encounter that deepens relationships, brings individuals closer together, and empowers everyone involved. So it's not just difficult conversation. The confrontation can be an appreciation. Again, it could be helping someone across the street, to use a very classic image. And the more I'm doing that in a given day, the more I'm using my time well. And so a lot of my day is devoted to that. And I've cultivated relationships around the world, having lived in the Netherlands and different places in the US, and working with various types of people and organizations around the planet. And that, on some level, that's more capital for me than you could say money, unfortunately, for my bank account. But that is true capital for me, is that cultivation of relationship, the empowerment of others.
So I know you facilitate a weekly lasting peace meditation, a global online lasting peace meditation on Tuesdays each week. Why did you start that, and what is lasting peace? So
this fits into this idea of why is it, even though we know better, we still have arguments and fights? One of the answers is we're disconnected. And it's an illusion. It's because we're very connected through social media and the internet. And that is true. Technologically, we're connected. But again, we take in information about suffering on the other parts of the planet and power games and what's happening. But it's not taking us into action. It's not dropping into our hearts, which lead us into compassionate action, right? So again, I'm always thinking, what are the daily things that we can do to create more connection and overcome separation? And many of us don't have those outlets. So I've always created like peace marches, which I would call heart walks, where I would map out the route on a map in a city, map out a route that's in the shape of a heart and walk it as a meditation on peace, and gather people, get them out away from their TVs and their internets, and get them out on the street connecting to strangers, or peace vigils and peace meditations. Did one in front of the White House last year for the United Nations International Day of Peace, a meditation on peace called Occupy Your Heart, as a movement. And I'm creating a monthly event here in DC called Courageous Civility, which is to get people who want to advocate for civility and aren't feeling empowered to do it, to meet with others who want to cultivate practices, internal practices, and also strategies, and just feeling like you're with someone that resonates with similar values as yours. The thing you mentioned was a weekly meditation called a weekly meditation for lasting peace. That's an opportunity, again, to connect with others on a weekly basis in the comfort of your own home or at work, using the power of the internet, and in a sense as a kind of loving resistance to what the internet is becoming, which is a place where people feel entitled and free to be mean and aggressive and harmful and violent. So while that energy is, if you look at the internet as an entity, as a system, energetic system, a network, think about all the negativity that's flowing into it. And so it's time for us on some level to heal that system and inject it with loving energy and compassion. So lasting peace, that's a whole other conversation. You have another hour? Just very quickly to say lasting peace is more, because peace is not the final solution. Peace actually is the first step. I don't think that our species has ever experienced peace. We talk about striving for it, and in fact, I'm beginning to think that it's a modern phenomenon, the idea of peace. And that we signed peace treaties. But I've worked with, in peace conferences, I've worked with people who have been in some of the top negotiations, like in Ireland, to actually get a peace treaty signed. And what they would say to me is, Joe, we need your work now after we sign the treaty, because we may have signed treaties, but we still hate each other, and we're still we may not be shooting each other, but we're sabotaging each other. So the next step, that's where the work really begins. Peace is the first step. Lasting peace is, how do I, on a day-to-day basis, check into my own reactivity, my own labeling of labeling someone an enemy, or labeling someone a stranger, or labeling someone loved one, and realize that it's those very things of grasping to my loved one. For those of you who do Buddhist practice, you'll recognize what I'm saying, of having indifference to strangers, which is what I've talked about actually most of this discussion, and having animosity and aversion to enemies. It's those things that are perpetuating the separation. Even the grasping to loved ones, it's still separation. You're still labeling them and not taking the time to see them for who they are. So the meditation is about us cultivating, of going within and confronting the aspects of us that are challenged by letting go of our aversion to enemies, our indifference to strangers, and our attachment to loved ones. As we do that, we cultivate more equanimity, which just makes us more resilient to be the very force that needs to happen on this planet at this time to create the change that I feel needs to happen. And that so desperately has to happen.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for the work that you are doing. Thank you for occupying our hearts today. And thank you for this confrontation. I guess it was a confrontation.
Yes, I know for me it was, because I feel more empowered. I feel closer to you.
Me too.
And I want to just say that, imagine just by the connection we had in this conversation, all that we and generated with each other. Imagine that these are the causes of lasting peace on this planet. Imagine. Why not?
I'm going to go with that.
Okay. And that can lead us to not only universal oneness, but relative oneness as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.